Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
Today we are going to be talking about Generation Z, which is so exciting to me as a millennial because I'm finally off the hot seat and we can talk about the next generation. The baton has officially been handed off and the new adults are officially not part of my generation.
Yes, and I'm speaking as a millennial too. It's interesting. I remember when I first realized that some of my coworkers and my friends are not in the same generation as me. It was eye-opening to not be the youngest adults in the workforce anymore. I don't know if you had that experience too, but I found myself thinking about how I didn't see things the same way as them or didn't have the same priorities. And, I think it can be a tendency, whoever we are, whatever generation we're in, to think, why can't they just see it my way? Or to make assumptions about other generations, make, sweeping statements that then we kind of just apply to anyone younger, anyone older. But it's so important to have humility to see things from other people's perspectives, whether they're younger or older. And, it was in that moment that I realized, okay, now I kind of get how the older generations might have seen me, and I can learn from that and have this humility to then ask them questions, learn from them, or ask, those in a younger generation to learn from them too. There's always something to be learned from each other.
It's so true that whatever you kind of grew up with is normal and everything after that feels bizarre and unnecessary, and everybody older than you just is out of touch.
Yeah.
And I think about that so much, and maybe this is just me, but with technology and how people quickly adapt to the things that they grew up with, and then after that, they kind of certain people, and I'm one of those people, kind of freeze at that point. And I remember when the iPod came out when I was in high school, and just how mind blowing that was. That so much music could fit on one little device. But it was even shocking to me of why somebody would need that much music in your pocket at any moment. But
Yeah.
things keep on moving, and that's now
Yes.
it feels
Yes.
so old.
Yeah, that's funny. It feels like so long ago. In high school, what comes to my mind right away when it comes to technology was, at least for me, it was AOL Instant Messenger and that development of being able to chat with friends in real time. And, I think it was still dial up internet, and it certainly wasn't internet in my pocket like we have today with smartphones. But having that back and forth conversation was really fun and felt so new for that time.
It was. I could remember those two as well. Just where you sit there and what you're doing there, your dedicated time to chat back and forth. It's not a passive thing. You're engaged in a
Yes.
chat with
Yeah.
maybe 10 people, but at least
Oh,
you're
yeah.
sitting at a computer for that purpose.
Yeah, and if you're not there, you had to tell them where you were in your little away message.
Mhm. Different times.
We're going to talk with our guest today about generations and Gen Z specifically, and how this ties in bigger picture with our understanding of faith and missions. So I'm really excited for this conversation. We're joined today by Dr. Alan Ye, who is a professor of intercultural studies and missiology at Biola University in California. Alan is a prolific writer and teacher, and we're focusing specifically in on that generational research today.
Alan has a bachelor's degree from Yale University, an MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, a master's of theology from Edinburgh University, and a doctorate of philosophy from Oxford University.
Alan serves on the board of trustees for the International Theological Seminary, teaches about missions in a summer school for crew, and is deeply involved with the Lausanne movement.
Let's go over to that conversation now.
Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Alan Ye.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have this conversation with you today. And before you joined us, Heather and I were having a conversation about different inventions that we got to experience in high school. So I mentioned how the iPad came out when I was in high school, and that just blew my mind, just what they could do. And I'm curious about you. Is there anything that came out when you were in high school that you remember just blowing your mind as far as new technology, what was possible at that point?
Well, I mean, I grew up in the Back to the Future generation, so
Okay.
Okay.
we were imagining things like flying cars and hoverboards, and of course, when the actual hoverboard came out a few years ago, it was a little bit disappointing. But actually, the technology that blew my mind was email, because I'm a Gen
Oh,
Xer.
yeah.
Okay, so I remember when I was in high school, we learned about this radical new thing called email. And then we all learned that when you get to
Mhm.
college, everyone will have their own email account. And I couldn't believe it. And I couldn't wait for that. That was like super exciting to me. Yeah. And now, sort of as a professor, email is a little bit the bane of my existence because
Right,
I can't
right.
keep up with it. I feel like
Yeah.
I have two full-time jobs. One is being a professor and
Mhm.
the other is answering emails. So
For sure. That's great.
Yeah, it is so interesting to think about how things evolve over time. I'm with you on the email comment. That is, it's just kind of always there now. But it almost is hard to remember a time before we had that, even though that definitely wasn't that long ago. So, one of the things that you have researched is into generations. And so, Alan, as we are getting started, maybe you can fill us in on how you first became interested in generational research and how that's interacted with other areas of study that you've explored.
yeah, that's a great question. Well, I teach intercultural studies and missions. And when we talk about culture, a lot of times people think about nationality or ethnicity in terms of cultures. And that's obviously the first protocol. But I think when you look at the Apostle Paul, and in three of his epistles, in Galatians and Ephesians and Colossians, he dives into different demographics of what the church should be like in terms of diversity. And he talks about, Jew and Gentiles, so that's racial diversity. He talks about slave and free, that's socioeconomic or social class diversity. We have male and female, and then he also talks about children and parents. So when we talk about culture, it's not just ethnicity and nationality or even gender, it's also age. So the different generations are different cultures, even if they come from the same country. And so I think it's really necessary for us to think critically about how different generations can speak to each other.
That's so interesting. I'm excited for this conversation and just to see how we talk about it. Because you also mentioned parents and kids I feel like are judged for just being kids. Um, and then also when we talk about generations, those kids eventually become adults. So I remember growing up, I was a millennial. You said you're a Gen X. Certain stereotypes are created about our generations, and now we're adults. And how you see those playing out of, oh, they were right. We did shape out that way, or it wasn't accurate. It was just we were all kids at some point. How do you look at that as far as predictions, and you can predict and things are different, and even for your own experience of all the accusations that were thrown around at Gen Xers, and now you're an adult, you're like, okay, Gen X, it did turn out that way, or those were people being judgmental about us when we were kids?
And obviously, there are stereotypes, but,
Stereotypes, yeah.
on the whole, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Gen Xers, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but we came after boomers, and baby boomers are called such because they had a lot of population birth rate during those years. But we came afterwards, and we were a smaller segment of the population because of we didn't have as much birth rate. But the X actually stands for nothingness. That's where that came from, you know.
Huh.
And it's funny because you have Gen Y, or otherwise known as millennials, and Gen Z, and it's sort of alphabetic. But actually, X doesn't stand for like the letter X. It actually
Huh.
stands
Huh.
for nothing. We're supposedly the nothing generation. We're supposedly the cynical generation. The movie that came out several decades ago. Reality Bites starring Winona Ryder, right? That was like the ultimate like Gen X movie, right? And it turns out that we're not like this hopeless, cynical generation at all.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And in fact, I saw a meme someone posted once. They said Gen Xers, because we grew up with the threat of nuclear war happening imminently in our lifetime at any moment, like the USSR and the USA could like destroy each other. We've developed some sort of grit, right, and tenacity, and every generation has good and bad, and I think that sometimes if you look at other generations, maybe the tenacity needs to be built up a little bit more, right? But I feel like Gen Xers, we do have that tenacity. Um, you knock us down, we get right back up, and so now, what's interesting about Gen Xers, though, is because we're a smaller segment of the population, and then also boomers are living longer and also retiring later, that Gen Xers are supposedly actually supposed to be taking the reins of leadership in organizations and around the
Hmm.
world. We're not yet. we haven't gotten
Mhm.
there yet because the boomers are still hanging on.
Yeah.
So it's sort of the, think of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles, right? It's like,
Yep.
how long did Charles have to wait to become king? Really long time, because Elizabeth just hung on forever, right? So Gen Xers are feeling a little bit like that. It's our time, but we also feel like we're not being given our time in the spotlight just yet. So it's a very interesting generation to be in.
How does that feel? Because I think when Gen Xers were younger, when adolescents, nobody predicted them having a lot of grit. Maybe they did. Maybe that was part of the prediction. But how can that inform us as we start this conversation about Gen Z of how much weight to put on our predictions and like our models and our expectations?
Right. So I'll give you an example of a difference between Gen X and Gen Z. So when I was in high school, I remember I got my driver's license on my 16th birthday. Right? I could not wait. I was like, and in contrast, you look at Gen Zers, they don't get their driver's license until they're in their 20s. Okay. And
Hmm.
there's a reason for this. Parenting and safety. This is a big thing that differentiates. Gen Zers often have lawnmower parents or snowplow parents. So what that is the parent paves the way in front of the kid so that they remove all obstacles so that Gen Zers don't have to overcome those obstacles when they get to it. Well, then this doesn't build grit, right? Gen Xers, we were latchkey kids. We were like left to our own devices. We had to figure everything out ourselves. And so I remember when when I was in elementary school, I would walk a mile each way to elementary school on my own with no supervision. Now, there's no way I would ever do that for my kid today, right? Because I'd just be afraid of kidnapping, and rightfully so. But what that did is it built in a lot of independence in me. And Gen Zers, the parents are much more conscientious about safety. But because of the snowplow or lawnmower, Gen Zers are safer because this is a more dangerous world. So I'm not naysaying this, but they also haven't developed grit. So there's like a 4-year developmental delay. If you compare Gen Xers versus Gen Zers, their developmental growth is different. So a Gen Xer when they were in college, um, a a Gen Xer when they were in high school uh, is maybe similar to a maturity level of a Gen Zer when they're in college because of the 4-year developmental delay. Because why aren't Gen Zers getting driver's license? Because their parents are driving them around because they're afraid that they might get in a car
Mm,
accident. Which
mm,
again, I'm not naysaying that because that happens, right?
yeah.
But when I was 16, I got my driver's license on my 16th birthday. I would like drive my car to the mall, hang out with my friends. We didn't have cell phones in those days. My parents had no idea where I was, right? And that's how I lived my life. And thankfully, I wasn't doing drugs or, doing anything bad. And thankfully, nothing ever happened to me. But what if something did happen to me, right? So it's a tricky balance between how do parents protect their kids, but also allow them to spread their wings and fly instead of doing it all for them.
So as we think about having conversation about Gen Z and we're going off of some of these generalized statements that have been made about Gen X and millennials, what do you think is important to keep in mind about making comments about a generation in general? Before we get into the details about Gen Z.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are several things that you can say. One is that this is an art, not a science. So when we define a generation, for example, Gen X is generally those born between 1965 to 1982. Well, that's a pretty big range. In other words, those born in 65 versus those born in 82, the 65s might be more similar in characteristics to boomers, whereas the 82s might actually be more similar to millennials. And so you can't overgeneralize about a generation just because of that. Secondly, a lot of the reason why we have these generational categories is because they were shaped by global events, right? So whether it be the Cold War or World War II or 9/11 or the 2008 financial crisis or COVID, right? Now, some of these things impacted some people more than others. Um, and so it's not as if everyone in every generation is impacted the same via these world events. And I also think that because Gen Zers have a more connected world in the sense that the smartphones have connected them. And so globally, Gen Zers are maybe more alike because of the connection, whereas Gen Xers or boomers, it would differ from country to country because we weren't as globally connected. And so a Gen Xer in the United States versus a Gen Xer in China would have experienced different things. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. It's helpful to understand how we can have a framework for understanding generations in general as we dive into focusing on one of those generations today. And yeah, thanks for giving us some comparisons and examples there. That's really helpful. So let's dive into, we're going to spend the rest of our time here thinking about and looking at who Gen Z is and how this relates to faith and missions. And I know these things are really close to your heart, Alan. So let's start off with, who is Gen Z? Maybe you can give us a brief profile of key characteristics of this generation as we're getting started with that.
Absolutely. So the years that define Gen Z really start from after 9/11. So the millennials are generally those who were born in the years leading up to 9/11, but because of the millennium, right, the year 2000 and 2001. But Gen Zers are generally 2002 to about 2015. And because they live in a post 9/11 world that has shaped them. So they have never known a world where there wasn't 9/11. But I think even more, they are shaped by the advent of the iPhone, which was invented, I believe, in 2007. So when Gen Zers came of consciousness, they uh, basically grew up with the iPhone, and that has shaped them. And so this is why Gen Zers are sometimes known as iGen. So University of San Diego professor Jean Twenge wrote a book called iGen. And in this book, she outlines how she thinks that the number one thing that characterizes Gen Z is the formation via screens. Now, I think that actually is really important, but I also think that that's maybe the second most prominent thing that has shaped Gen Z. I'll talk about the first one in just a little bit. But other things that have shaped Gen Z, I know that older generations tend to sometimes denigrate Gen Z, but one of the things that they're really great at is diversity, for example. So I think that Gen Zers have a lot to teach older generations about diversity. Um, and Gen Zers also, however, I think suffer from mental health crises, and but some of it is a lot of it is not their fault. I think they were handed kind of a raw deal, right? And I had mentioned some of these things like the 2008 financial crisis and COVID and such. But I think they've also been handed, a world which is polarized politically, and they've also been handed a world which is suffering from climate change and, a lack of resources and intense competition. And so, in some ways, I think that Gen Zers have some right to be anxious and a little bit fearful about what's coming up next. Things don't look as rosy as they maybe did for Gen Xers or even millennials. Millennials have a lot more confidence than Gen Zers. And by the way, millennials are now, in their 30s, right?
Yes, we
I think
are.
sometimes boomers and Gen Xers look down at the younger generation, and they say, "Oh, it's all those millennials," and they'll stereotype them. And I'm like, "You're actually talking about Gen Zers because
Mhm.
millennials are actually like, yeah, they're in their 30s now, right?" So, but millennials are the ones who are stereotyped with a lot of confidence, and I think Gen Z is a lot more fearful because of the scarcity. Uh, Millennials are the ones who are sometimes the confidence can come across as negative, right? So people are like, "Oh, you're entitled. Like you think that you ought to be CEOs of every company in the world, and you can save the world via social justice and whatnot." Gen Zers are a little bit of the opposite. They're happy just to get a job, and they don't know where their next paycheck is going to come from, and they're the first generation to make less money than their parents, and so in many ways, there's a right to to be scared and worried about this. So I'm not, I think if older generations denigrate the younger generations for this, I'm like, yeah, but we're the ones who foisted this like really nasty world upon them, right? It's in some ways it's not their fault. Let me give you an example of the intense competition. When I applied to college, so I went to Yale University for my undergrad. Do you know what the acceptance rate for Yale was when I went as a Gen Xer? It was 17%. Do you know what the acceptance rate today is? 4%. Like, I don't know that I could get into Yale today if I applied, right? Because, and so it's not as if, my life was necessarily harder than those who came after us, right? In some ways, maybe their life is actually harder than mine was, right? We often think the older generations had it harder, right? And then the younger generations have it easier. But sometimes we might think of it as flipped.
Different challenges and obstacles and different resources available at different times, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's so helpful, even as you said, these are kind of things that are foisted upon them. I mean, obviously, people are not going to thoughtfully blame anybody on like they grew up after 9/11, they had the like 2008 or downturn, and just all those different things. And, parents, lawnmower parents, helicopter parents, those are the parents' faults. Those are not the kids' faults. But that's just so helpful to remember as we talk about this generation of figuring out who they are and what their reaction to these situations are. But the situations are not their faults. So we're going to kind of shift over to talking about faith. And I'm so curious to hear how Generation Z looks at faith, it looks at Christianity and calling themselves Christians, and if that's different than previous generations.
Yes, absolutely. So not only do Gen Zers make less money than their parents, but this is the first generation to really have a faith downturn in the sense that there's just not as many people going to church or being interested in Christianity as much among Gen Zers. They're sometimes known as the nuns, not Nuns, but Nones, because they have no religion, right? Or at least no formal organized religion. And so with the Gen Zers, it's harder to reach them with the institutional church. Let's put it that way. It's not necessarily that they are less interested in Christianity. It's just that the traditional methods don't work as well. So, James Chong wrote a great book called True Story. And in this, he says that the four generations each have a gateway question in order to reach them. And for boomers, their gateway question is, what is true? For Gen Xers, our gateway question is, what is real? For millennials, the gateway question is, what is good? And for Gen Zers, the gateway question is, what is beautiful? Now, what's happening is because boomers are largely still in charge, right? Like I said, the retirement age has gone up. So boomers who should have been retired are still running churches and ministries and corporations. And so everything is still going through boomer culture and boomer lenses in some sense. And you see this in theological education as well. So, what do you see, for example, evangelical seminaries emphasizing? Apologetics. They're still emphasizing, Josh McDowell, more than a carpenter, or Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, these sort of apologetics. And those had their day and their place. But when you try to use apologetics and use it towards Gen Z, who their question is not what is true, their question is what is beautiful, it doesn't land, it doesn't scratch their itch. And you wonder why they are fleeing from the institutional church. It's because the older generation are trying to argue them into the kingdom of God. And that doesn't work, right? And, recently, the Super Bowl had it was very interesting. They had a few very Christian ads in it. Now I realize there are all sorts of like possible controversies with those ads and how much money was spent on them, and was it attacking a certain demographic or whatnot. But one of the ads really tried to emphasize that Christians are they're trying to emphasize that Christians are not as bigoted as the younger generation might think we are, right? So, uh, are we bigoted towards, for example, the LGBTQ community, or are we racist, or are we, uh, overly political, supporting the Republican Party, or whatever? And the Super Bowl ad was saying, no, it was trying to portray that no, Jesus loves. It's not Jesus hates, right? Um, and I do think that in many ways that's the right message that needs to be sent, because that's beauty, right? And you notice, for example, the rise and popularity of the TV show The Chosen, which is about the life of Jesus. And Gen Zers are turned on by that because they see a Jesus who's beautiful. He moves their heart. So it's that kind of beauty that Gen Z longs for, and not apologetics. Yeah. And so, but what is interesting is also Gen Zers, they have a rise of sexuality in terms of their identity, right? So they're much more prone to be pro LGBTQ, and probably 4 times as many Gen Zers identify with that community as opposed to other generations. And so I think this has some interplay with whether or not they accept the institutional church, right?
That is so interesting. Even the what is beauty, you could see it easily just be dismissed as like superficial. But I like to think of, the gospel is called good news. It's not like, I mean, that feels like that matches up with beauty. Like what is good news, what is beautiful, versus maybe some of the other perspectives. And yeah, not right or wrong, but this is what the gospel is.
Let's take a short break for a story from the field.
My name is Gloria Cruz. I'm from Belize, Belmopan City, and I'm serving at the Belize Christian Academy. They see a different way of working. They see that, it's not only I either do good in school or get out, but they're always trying and trying. And it also for me, because I grew up in a strict home, right? A strict home that you either do good or you're out, right? But here, because of God, there's a lot of grace and grace and grace, and it helps me give myself grace. My own kids get grace, and we get to see this other side, because if you grow up poor, you look at the rich people and you say, oh, they are rich, they don't know. But then you see that we all have something in common. And I feel like in God's world, everybody is the same. He doesn't see if you grew rich or poor. He feels like all of us need the love of God. All of us need his grace. All of us need that. So, and that's my story.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Thinking Christian International School in South Korea. To learn more, visit teachmeon.org/go. Click on the link in the show notes. Would you say, just as we're talking, this is kind of a global audience that might be listening, are these trends of Christianity kind of going on a downward turn, maybe organized religion? Is that a global trend we're seeing, or is that maybe Western or United States?
Absolutely. This is one area in which the iPhone is not actually making a homogeneity around the world. In many ways, with social media, it is, but with Christianity, it's not. There is an increasing rise of Christianity in the non-Western world, what is often called the majority world. So if you look at Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the numbers of Christians continue to grow. And in the West, the number of Christians continues to decline. And on the one hand, there's a lament that there are not as many Christians in the West. But on the other hand, it's great that the numbers are just picking up worldwide. So Christianity is really becoming this global religion. like truly global. It's not just in the West. And when you see the sort of general balance of this, what we're ending up seeing is that a lot of majority world Christians who perhaps are less wealthy, maybe more communal rather than individualistic, maybe more understanding concepts of the gospel as honor and shame as opposed to just innocence and guilt, who are maybe more primed towards social justice and creation care. Um, and I could say much more, just open to spiritual realities, etc. But what we're seeing is that Christians around the world are starting to look a lot more like the first century church. And I think that's actually great. Instead of an individualistic, capitalist, materialistic, um, you know, kind of church which seeks political power. And if this is the case, and if the global church is starting to look more like the first century church, I think this will attract Gen Zers a lot more, because I think they're kind of turned off to the mega churches and to the displays of the abuses that we're seeing in the Western church, and the downfall of certain popular leaders. And so I think there's a lot of hope for this, and I think it's a great trend. And also, you know what? It also helps the West because we're seeing a lot of majority world Christians come to the West now. They're immigrating to the West. And one of the reasons that the United States is still being propped up in our Christianity is because of immigrants and people of color. And if not for this, I think that the United States might be quite a non-Christian country by this point, you know? And so, yeah, but I think it helps us to be aware of and find the need to listen to our brothers and sisters around the world.
So we've been talking about Gen Z and characteristics, how they understand faith. Let's look specifically at missions or the understanding of the Great Commission. What's their understanding of missions? Who do they see as the mission field? Break that down for us a little bit.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I have noticed that a lot of Gen Zers are not as theologically educated. And again, maybe this has to do with the people who are the parents, or, the people who are supposedly passing this on. But the words Great Commission do not necessarily resonate or even pick up on the radar of a lot of Gen Zers. But if you say missions, that gets often a negative reaction, because what they think of is colonialism. And again, rightfully so, because this was actually a lot of what missions was during the 19th century, for example, and even the 20th century. So, I mean, the word missions doesn't even appear in the Bible. It is actually historically an Iberian word which came from the conquistadors. So, Iberia being Spain and Portugal, and it was their ventures into the New World. And so the Spanish word missio, or mission, and the Portuguese word missão, actually indicates this colonial imperialistic endeavor to conquer new lands in the New World and take over people, which often involves slavery and such. So I don't blame people for not liking the word mission. Now, of course, I don't think that the word mission is bad in and of itself, in the sense that if we do it from a Christian sense, then rather than from an imperialistic sense, I think it's good, right? It's basically to preach the good news and spread the good news, and spread the kingdom of God. But I do think that maybe we need a different word these days in order to capture Gen Z if they want to be on board with it. So if the Great Commission is not something they really know much about, and if the word mission seems like a bad word to them, and even, Campus Crusade for Christ, they changed their name to Cru because the word crusade also has negative connotations. And so I think we need to be much more sensitive about our language with Gen Z. But I think maybe a better word than mission could be something like witness. That is actually a biblical word, right? It's the biblical word martyr. Now, of course, in the first century, people would witness by dying for their faith. That's where the word martyr gets its connotations. But you don't have to die to be a witness. And I think that the Great Commission, if we can re-educate people and show that, number one, if we look in Matthew 28, the chief verb of the Great Commission is not to evangelize, it is to make disciples. Now, what's the difference between evangelism and discipleship? Uh, it is like the difference between a wedding and a marriage. Okay. Evangelism is like a wedding, it's the initiatory act that kicks off the relationship. The um, but discipleship is more like the marriage. It is the day-to-day lived out experience with the other where you have to die to yourself daily. Okay. So, and I actually think that's the latter is more important, right? What's more important, the marriage or the wedding? Well, I think the marriage. And same thing, I think discipleship is actually more important than evangelism. I think sometimes Gen Zers think that evangelism is just shoving the gospel down someone's throat. But if we can emphasize discipleship, which is, um, getting people to live their life with Jesus, I mean, and to continue to live their life with Jesus for the rest of their life, that is a much more compelling thing. One of the best ways to think about discipleship is a quote by Eugene Peterson, who says that discipleship is a long obedience in the same direction. I think that's a great way to think about it. Another way I think to think about it is how we do it in terms of the order. There's an order of operations. You can either think about the three B's or the three F's. And let me just say this, in the West, we often teach that people have to do believing and then behaving and then belonging. But in the Bible, it's actually more belonging, then believing, then behaving. So I think that we need to change the order in which we're doing things. And it's not about which one is more important. This is simply order of operations. This is effectiveness. And if we try to convert people's minds before we show them love, it's not going to work, right? But if you show them love, then their minds will be transformed as a result. Or so that's the three B's. Instead of believing, behaving, belonging, the Bible is more belonging, believing, behaving. And then also the three F's. In the West, we often say, teach them the facts, then it's faith, then it's feeling. But in the Bible, it's more feeling, then faith, then facts. Okay. You move people's hearts. This is what, the beautiful, right? The feeling first, and then the facts come later. You start with the facts with apologetics. You're not going to get to the feeling, right? You're just going to have people's walls come up because you're trying to argue them into the kingdom. And that doesn't sit well with Gen Z.
Yeah, I love how you're talking about. I mean, you use the word witnesses there. That's what we're called to be, is to tell the story, and story is such an impactful and connecting experience and way to share the gospel too.
One more thing I want to say about Gen Z is that because they're often denigrated by the older generation as, for example, they're snowflakes or whatever, and it's like, actually, it's the lawnmower parents or these snowplow parents that made them snowflakes if, you don't build grit in your kid. So, and that's actually one thing that I wanted to say, that probably the number one thing that has impacted Gen Z is parenting. So Jason Dorsey from the Center for Generational Kinetics says that parenting is the number one influencer, even more than screens. And I think I agree with him on that. But the reason why I say this, and by the way, snowflakes also occur in the older generation. I see a lot of older generation on social media who just get so defensive about everything and just send out a tweet storm whenever, they're barely insulted, and they're anyway. The point is that we see these things in every generation, but with Gen Z, I think instead of denigrating them, and mocking them for having participation trophies, which by the way the older generation gave them, so it's like parenting is really important. um, but I think if the older generation can actually see the potential and the hope and the goodness of Gen Z, then they can be mobilized to do great things for the future. But if the older generation always rolls their eyes at Gen Z and, you know, denigrates them, then Gen Gen Z is not going to fulfill their potential. In fact, there's just going to be generational warfare. And this is why the younger generation says, "Okay, boomer," right? This is their way of rolling their eyes back at the older generation. So, and I think that Gen Z have such a huge potential for fulfilling a mission in this world. And especially if we can connect them with global Christians, the global evangelicals. I feel like the non Western evangelicals, in many ways, are the best hope of speaking to Gen Zers because there's a lot of resonance with both cultures, the Gen Zers in the West. And but that I think is a compelling vision of what Christianity can be. And I think if we can make that connection, that'll be really great for the global church.
Hmm. Hmm. What I'm hearing from you is optimism about how Gen Z could be involved in sharing the gospel when it's presented to them in a way that connects with them, and then when the opportunities to go perhaps or to share locally are those that resonate with how they're wired.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it.
Alan, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really good conversation. A lot of good reminders for how to interact with the Gen Z and just understanding where they're coming from. Before we let you go, though, we have one question which we like to ask all of our guests, and that's what's one thing that's changing your life right now. So this can be something really big or something small that's just making a changing your life for this week.
And true confessions, Kian and I this week were like, is our lives still changing? Because we do answer this question every week, but we both did come up with something. It's a little bit lighthearted, but you can take it a little more serious if you want, because this is your one shot at what's changing your life. So just a forewarning. But Kian will go first and then me, so you have a moment to think about it. But
Yes. Yeah. What is changing my life this week is we recently moved down to North Carolina a few years ago, but we're taking a big trip out to the mountains to go sledding.
mm.
So we missed the snow, and so we're going to get a shot to go sledding or tubing down a hill with my kids. So that is changing our life this week.
Okay, mine's also weather related, but on the flip side, we recently had a few kind of unseasonably warmer days because I live in Pittsburgh and it is definitely winter here. So getting to read outside on my balcony is something I usually don't get to do until April, May, the summertime. And so it's been really nice to um, be able to have a little bit more time outdoors and not worry about the winter temperature. So, what about you, Alan? What has been changing your life lately?
Thanks for asking. You both had such delightful answers. I don't mean to dampen the mood at
Mm,
all, but I'm in the middle of a job transition. This is a big
mm,
change for me. As we are talking about Gen Z and their interest in missions, we are seeing the decline. There's a huge decline of Gen Zers interested in missions. And again, I think the potential is there, and I have the hope for that. But I teach in the School of Intercultural Studies at Biola University, and due to not enough students, our school is shutting down. They're actually closing the school. And so at the end of this academic year, I will be transitioning to a different job. And it's kind of a little bit daunting to think about what's next.
mhm,
So we shall see. And
yeah.
so, but I'm going to trust God in this process.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to see how these trends and the observations that you shared are actually part of the reality that you're facing in career at this moment. And I just really appreciate your willingness to share with us some of your perspectives as we look at Gen Z and think about the future of missions. And that's something you're experiencing right now as well. So we just really appreciate your time and willingness to share today and walking us through this conversation, Alan.
Thank you both. I'm delighted to be here.
Kian and I serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all He intends. Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.
The mystery word for this week is global.